I am so excited about this webinar today. My name is Chantal. I'm with NSDA, and welcome. And we have the Ferguson Group with us today to talk about emergency response and disaster preparedness. I know for me personally, this is a really important topic, having worked through and lived through several disasters in Colorado. And always looking to understand how the funding works, where it's coming from, when it's going to come is just critical for all of you. And to know this in advance. So I'm going to turn it straight over to Gabby and Christy and take it from here. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Chantal. So just a little bit of housekeeping. If you guys have questions, we are very much want them. So please send them our way. I think you can add them into the Q&A function and then into the chat as well. We'll be monitoring those as we go. So if you have anything that comes up, please feel free to pop it in there and we'll either answer it as it comes up or hold till the end of the presentation. Just kind of depending on what the topic is and if we know we're going to address it. For those of you if this is your first time being on an NSDA webinar or brown bag, my name is Christy Moore. I'm the managing partner of grants at the Ferguson Group. The Ferguson Group is the grant resource and grant specialist team dedicated to NSDA and all of you in the special districts world. So welcome. I'm going to let Gabby introduce herself really quickly. We also have Amanda Wiley, who's on vacation today, so she's not joining, but she's a steady member of the NSDA team as well. Gabby's coming in as an expert in the topics that we're discussing today, so I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for having me. My name's Gabby Romsey. As Christy mentioned, I'm a principal with the Ferguson Group. I've been with TFG for over 8 years now and have done a lot of work in the disaster mitigation space. So very happy to be here with all of you today and walk you through some of what's going on at the federal level.
Thanks, Gabby. So a little bit of the lay of the land and what we're going to cover today. What we've designed these brown bags to do is really focus on certain topics of interest to special districts. The topics were actually chosen based on feedback and surveys that we took in 2024 of special districts and the types of grants and funding opportunities that you're most interested in learning about. This is the second one, the third webinar of the year, but the second brown bag of the year. We'll talk a little bit about what's upcoming. But today we're going to focus on emergency and disaster preparedness and go over the federal landscape for that, which has changed recently. So keep in mind, we picked these topics last year in 2024. And it actually became very advantageous that this is on the books because there are changes coming down the pipeline for emergency and disaster preparedness for special districts, as well as communities across communities in general. Gabby's going to go into a deep dive of the BRIC program, which is a program that's a bit in transition right now. And she'll talk a little bit about what that means. It's going to be very much the focus of the presentation today and the discussion. But then we're going to talk about a couple of other funding opportunities, mainly through FEMA, and then provide some guidance on best practices as you're looking to address your needs and apply for grants or find grants to match up with your programs. So next slide, Gabby. A little bit of a lay of the land on what is happening on the federal funding landscape when it comes to emergency response and disaster preparedness, to just make sure we're all on the same page here. There are several key departments and agencies at the federal level that provide emergency response and disaster preparedness funding to localities. And when I say localities, I mean communities in general, which include special districts. So all of these grants that we're going to talk about, and really across the board, all special districts are able to apply to. There's very few programs out there that you're not eligible to directly apply to. And we don't focus those or feature those anyways. So the agencies that we're really going to dive into are DHS and specifically FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency. From the federal perspective, that is where the heart of the money comes for both on the post-award, or I'm sorry, the post-disaster and emergency response side, as well as the pre-disaster mitigation side. However, USDA and the Department of Energy, or I'm sorry, the Department of Interior, and even the Corps of Engineers also has programs that are really designed to tackle some of that emergency response and disaster preparedness, dedicated to certain types of actions or certain types of projects. We're not going to really talk about those today. Today, we're really going to be focused on FEMA because, as I said, that is where the heart of a lot of the funding comes for communities, especially on the pre-mitigation side or the pre-disaster side. With all of that said, there is a little bit of change. And there is a little bit of activity when it comes to FEMA overall. So this isn't necessarily directed towards grant funding or funding availability, but as we've seen with the change in the administration, and really this is what happens anytime we have a new administration and new federal agencies come into play, and even new Congresses, is that we do start to see priorities change. The Trump administration has decided that they would like to see a shift in pre-disaster and emergency response across the board. So instead of focusing those efforts through FEMA, the president would actually like to see those efforts more directed towards the states and the localities, and shift those resources and the oversight of those resources actually to the White House. So he has released recommendations to phase out FEMA as an administration or as an agency overall, direct most of those resources to the White House as an office, but then keep FEMA in place to really be the oversight and really to come into major disasters and major catastrophes. And a part of the move that he has done in that capacity is in April, he eliminated or froze the BRIC program, which is really just stalled it. Gabby's going to go into that in a little bit more detail, but you can see that since the Trump administration has come into office, the FEMA conversation has been high on the list, as recently as announcing just this past month about the phasing out of FEMA after the 2025 hurricane season. Big star here. To completely eliminate an agency in its totality is very difficult to do, and actually requires congressional approval and oversight. So while we've seen activities and recommendations come out of the administrative and the executive office, we have also seen a reaction from Congress. So there's several proposals around the Hill in the form of legislation to also look at addressing the needs of FEMA and the programs that are administered by FEMA and those activities in a different way. So we anticipate that there's going to be continued activity and continued conversation about the new direction for FEMA, both at the executive level and the congressional level. And so we want to make sure that that's just kind of there and setting the scene. But what we do expect is that funding is still going to come out. So no matter what happens, either administratively through the executive office or through Congress, we highly anticipate and do not expect that the funding is going to go away completely. It just might be different in the way that communities go and access it, and the special districts would actually apply for the funding. So any questions there, feel free to put them into the chat. Some of the questions that we're going to, the programs that we're going to feature today are BRIC. Gabby's going to discuss that. And then the ever popular Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. Those are two programs administered by FEMA that are out on a regular basis that we do not anticipate will be impacted by any of these FEMA changes. Even if there is a shift to having those priorities go to the states, we anticipate that if there is that shift does occur, that funding will still be administered through the states. There is a lot of state activity in the application process already for those programs, so not a huge change there. And then the last program we're going to talk about is Emergency Operations Center Program, which is a grant program on the books, but is traditionally not funded unless it's earmarked by Congress. So it's a little bit of lay of the land in terms of the programs we're going to feature today as we move on. And one of the things that we wanted to keep in mind and really give you in terms of all of this activity on the FEMA level is just some points and some steps that you can take with your district if you are involved in either emergency response and post-disaster activities or pre-mitigation or pre-disaster mitigation activities. The biggest thing that we can tell you and advise you to do is to keep those contacts up with your FEMA and state officers. They're going to be the ones on the ground. They're going to understand where things are going and really where those funding is going, how to fund your project and any projects that might change or any priorities that might change and impact your projects. The other thing we advise you to do is contact your congressional delegation. Make sure that they understand how important these dollars are to you and what your needs are so that they can be engaged on your behalf and making sure that any changes that might happen at either the executive or legislative side are meeting the needs of the communities and their constituents. And continue to look at your funding strategies and your projects and reassess them to make sure that they're meeting the needs of the current administration and the current funding sources. Administrations, not just at the federal level, but also at the state levels in your individual states, and keep regular communication with your stakeholders and partners. So all key things, I feel like we say this with every brown bag. These are just great best practices in general to make sure that you're staying on top of these resources as they're available.
All right, thanks, Christy. We're going to head into our BRIC program deep dive. And, you know, as Christy mentioned, obviously, we know that the Trump administration has frozen or canceled this program. And so we want to talk a little bit about the background of the program, a little bit about its history, where the program is now, and kind of what we're envisioning for the future. And so the BRIC program is really a special program because it is a pre-disaster hazard mitigation program. It helps communities to proactively prepare for natural disasters. And so it typically provides funding in 3 different buckets: capability and capacity building activities, hazard mitigation projects, and management costs. Management costs are very interesting. A lot of times, you know, you're capped at 10% of total project costs for things, and BRIC actually allows a 15% cap, so a little higher than usual. The bulk of this, I would say, that I know we have a lot of interest in is really those hazard mitigation projects. You know, those provide for a range of different types of projects and combat things like flooding, wildfire, extreme heat, right? All of those types of things that you know you can apply for funding for. And so in 2024, the very last BRIC program solicitation that was released, there was about $750 million available in the pot to support awards nationwide. And something that we do really want to draw to attention about the BRIC program, and really about the majority of programs through FEMA, is that these are actually federal pass-through programs. And so what that means is that the dollars pass through to the states, who are technically considered the applicants, and then any local communities, like special districts, are then technically considered sub-applicants, and they apply through their state to the BRIC program. So I want to kind of give you a little bit more of information on what this process looks like, and I think this also gives you some insight as to why the Trump administration might have made some of the decisions that they did. So the BRIC program is a very lengthy application process. Many times from the time that you apply to the time that your award is announced, not necessarily even the time that you receive funds, the process can take over a year. This was one of the things that the Trump administration cited as a problem with the BRIC program, is that it was just basically too lengthy and too complicated for local governments, you know, and subrecipients to apply for it. And so, as I mentioned before, any local governments, special districts, any localities are required to apply through their state process, usually through their state emergency management agency. And so it's, you know, it's hard to fully nail down what that process looks like, because each state is going to have a little bit of a nuanced process. Many of them have pre-applications, or notices of intent. It just depends. So again, those processes change a little bit for localities. In terms of sub-recipient requirements, the application is quite complex. Applications require the scope of work, the budget, the ever important benefit cost analysis, and then your EHP, environmental and historic preservation checklist, and a FEMA approved mitigation plan. I want to draw everyone's attention to the benefit cost analysis. Your BCA is probably the most important item for the BRIC program, and for many of the other FEMA programs. You really want to score at least a 1 or above to be eligible and competitive. And to be honest, I think there was a lot of confusion around BCAs for many sub-applicants. And so, right, this is another type of barrier or just difficult requirement that I think the Trump administration has alluded to with its quarrels with the program. Finally, FEMA review and evaluation. Again, you need to go through a review process at your state level, which is a little nuanced. Each state does it slightly differently, but then they essentially decide which applications they want to put forth to FEMA for evaluation, and then FEMA will make sure that these applications are first eligible and then apply technical and qualitative criteria to select the projects that it wants to fund moving forward. So I want to take a step back and just kind of show you how BRIC started. Back in 1997, there was a launch of Project Impact, which was a smaller program, and it was really a pilot program and provided funding directly to communities. In 2000, the Disaster Mitigation Act was passed, and this created the start of PDM, or the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program. And so BRIC is technically within that suite of pre-disaster mitigation programs. Then finally, in 2018, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act gave rise to BRIC, which was the most robust funding source for pre-disaster and post-disaster mitigation, in the United States. And so finally, in 2020, you have the first BRIC application cycle. And I want to be clear, in 2018 and 2020, this is under the first Trump administration that this program began. And so we know that this is, has been a program that has had is oversubscribed in so many ways and is something that communities look to. And so I will say that the funding levels increased quite dramatically during the COVID era, and then kind of have come back down in the last year or two to what we initially saw the program be allotted funding for. So fast forward to 2025, we have, under the second Trump administration in April, there was an internal FEMA memo that was released that discusses the cancellation of BRIC for the FY24 NOFO, which was released under the Biden administration. And it also discusses freezes on FY20 to FY23 projects that were previously funded. And so it discusses freezes on project extensions, as well as halts to management cost obligation, and just generally discusses the need to review ongoing BRIC projects. And then just a couple of days later, FEMA formally cancels BRIC for any projects funded through FY20 through FY23. And so I do want to be clear, there's a lot of many of these projects are at different stages throughout the life cycle of a BRIC project. And so there's different yays or nays for different projects. And so what we wanted to do is try and have you guys understand the impacts of ongoing BRIC projects. So typically, if you are very far along in your application, in your project, the funding is fully obligated and it's under construction, generally you're allowed to proceed, and those projects are okay. Anything that has been fully obligated but has not started, those projects will end. Those have been canceled. For those projects that are kind of midway through in a phase, the administration is going to look at those on a case-by-case basis and may stop after a certain phase or at a logical point of what makes sense. And so with the impacts to current BRIC programs, it's a little bit of on a case-by-case and project-by-project basis. What we do know is that FEMA is not extending project deadlines for the most part. This is important because I will say, especially with construction projects, we often see extensions. And so, for them to say we're no longer extending project deadlines is really important for those applicants so they know exactly when they need to conclude their projects. That concludes our deep dive on BRIC. I know there's a lot of information thrown around there. So if you have questions on BRIC or anything related to BRIC, please feel free to put in the chat. We're happy to answer those questions at the end of the webinar session. And so with BRIC kind of up in the air, we do anticipate, as Christy mentioned, that the BRIC funding will be repurposed in some way. We know that that's something that is a definite possibility. Again, the BRIC program is something that has had very strong bipartisan support. It was created under the first Trump administration. So, we really just need to wait and see on how that funding might be repurposed for similar programming. What we also want to make sure we focus on today is the other funding programs through FEMA that are provide funding for emergency response and disaster preparedness. Those funding streams are still open and available for applications. So the first program that we want to highlight is the Hazard Mitigation Program, also known as HMG. So this program funds things like mitigation planning, flood protection, retrofitting of infrastructure, and construction projects. Really, HMGP provides a very wide scope on what it'll fund. Unlike the BRIC program, this is a little bit more of a reactive program. And the reason why is because you can only apply to this program after a presidential disaster declaration in your community is made. And so again, not everyone will qualify for this. Usually how the program works is it will set parameters to say only those disasters that were declared between, for example, 2020 and 2023 are eligible to apply here. So they'll set parameters on when those disasters can have happened, and you'll be responsible for making sure that your community falls within a declared area. So that's something, if you're interested in this program, definitely make sure that you go in and check that. I will say HMGP is currently accepting applications similar to BRIC. Localities are considered sub-applicants, and so you will need to go through your appropriate state agency to apply. There's many different solicitations out through state agencies, so that's something that you'll want to make sure and look for, depending on where your location is. And then, in terms of funding, there's a 25 cash or in-kind match that is required, and like many programs, this is a reimbursement-based program. Also for this program, a BCA is required as well, just like for BRIC. And so that's something that you'll want to take into consideration as well. Finally, you always need a local hazard mitigation plan or H&P at the time of the presidential major disaster declaration, or you can actually ask for funds for a new H&P. That's part of it. Obviously, we know that the most popular programs tend to deal with construction or renovation, flood protection, things like that. But if you had a major disaster declaration in your area, in your locality in the past few years, this is a really great program to look into and show that, if this funding may be able to help to provide resiliency against future disasters. Going to move on to our second really great program.
Gabby?
Oh, yes.
Yep, there was a question in the chat, just in case you didn't see it.
Oh, sorry.
Can you elaborate how HMGP allows for mitigation planning if it needs to be tied to a declaration that's already occurred? Or did I misunderstand that?
And how HMGP allows for mitigation planning if it needs to be tied to a disaster declaration. Oh, I see. Okay, so I'm wondering if the confusion was around the hazard mitigation plan. Yeah, so it's
Well, I'll jump in here. I think the question is how do you do mitigation planning if you can only receive the funds after a federal declaration? So a hazard mitigation grant program, the activities, while it opens up for those communities that are impacted by a disaster, the activities are not restricted to those activities or projects related to the disaster. So what the program is also designed to do is to help communities who are impacted by disasters prepare themselves to mitigate for those impacts for future disasters. So the assumption is if you had a flood or if you had a hurricane or if you had a wildfire, you're probably in an area that is predisposed to see that type of disaster again. So they want to help you get ready. So that's where that pre-disaster comes into the hazard mitigation grant program. Is that fair, Gabby, to explain it that way? Yeah. Another little nuance there too is that depending on how the federal declaration is declared and depending on how the governor asks for that declaration, sometimes the entire state can be opened up and qualify for additional hazard mitigation grant program, even if you're not one of the counties or areas that were actually included in the federal declaration. It's a little nuance there, but it's really dependent on if the governor requests it in a certain way, then when the president declares the federal declaration, it opens up the entire state. Most of the time that happens.
any other questions on HMGP before we move on to FMA?
Okay.
All right. We'll move on here to FMA, which, as you guessed, really deals with flood mitigation. And so, unlike HMGP, there is no presidential disaster declaration required for this. This program really focuses on flood risk reduction and flood mitigation projects. But there's also a capability and capacity building component that it allows funding for. Similar to BRIC and HMGP, you would apply through your state, who would be the applicant, and localities are allowed to be the sub-applicants. You know, they all run very similarly as federal pass-through dollars. Important for FMA is your NFIP policy, National Flood Insurance Protection Policy. You must have this in order to be eligible. The individual project structures must have this in order to be eligible for this program. And again, so you apply to your state. So there are state solicitations that are currently out right now, depending on where you are. Typically, we see FEMA release this program in the fall each year. So that's something to look out to, that your state would apply directly to for the federal government. In terms of cost share, there is a 25% non-federal cost share required for this. There are some nuances with this program. For this program, you want to show, in order to be competitive, that your structure, your project, wherever that may be, has unfortunately suffered repetitive loss, or severe repetitive loss is even better. Which sometimes we joke, the worse the situation, the more competitive you are with grants. So if you have a severe repetitive loss and you can prove this, you are eligible for up to a 90% cost share. and up to 100% for qualifying high loss NFIP insured structures. So the cost share for this one is a little nuanced, a little different, depending on the type of loss you've structured, depending on your NFIP stuff. So make sure to check that, make sure you really have a good handle on that. And I will say for all of these programs, for FMA, for HMGP, and previously for BRIC, a lot of states hold webinars. They will hold, office hours or things like that to help sub-applicants shape their project, to help ask questions. A lot of these are very, very complicated, especially when you have to provide benefit cost analysis, which you also have to do for FMA, and understand, how your project qualifies. And so that's something that we would encourage you to take advantage of if that occurs in your state. Look to see if they have that technical assistance component. Getting back to FMA, again, this is pre-disaster, similar to how BRIC is. Again, no presidential disaster declaration required. And entities are required to have or be recognized annex of a local hazard mitigation plan. Any questions on FMA?
Okay, not seeing any.
I will turn this over to Christy, who is going to talk about the EOCGP program. So Christy.
Sure, thank you. Gabby's turning this one over to me because of the nexus to the congressionally directed spending or the earmarking process, which is typically done through an advocacy effort and less on a direct application to the grant program. However, this is a different one in terms of the fact that while the majority of programs that are open to congressionally directed spending are not necessarily direct grant programs. The EOCGP is one of the exceptions to that rule. There are only a couple in that in capacity. BRIC is one of them. It's actually a program that's opened up for hazard mitigation in the congressional directed spending process, which basically means that if you want to try to work with your congressional delegation to secure funds through that, through the BRIC program, you have to follow everything along with the BRIC program, but they direct and get that included in the bill. The EOC program is a little bit different even in that capacity because it is an actual grant program that's on the books and authorized, but it rarely receives funding outside of the earmark process. So while you'll have, for BRIC, for example, program funding, authorized program funding and appropriated funding for the competitive application, as well as through the congressionally directed spending process, the EOC only gets the funding through the congressionally directed spending. I don't know why. It's been like this for decades at this point, but it is a resource that congressional delegations do like to utilize to be able to provide those EOC construction costs to their localities. So what you see here on the slide is the parameters and what it can fund, as well as how to apply if you're applying for the competitive process and the competitive application, which you still have to do after your member of Congress secures the funds for you. But it's just a little bit of a nuance in terms of the application process. The best thing about this program is it can fund construction. For those of you that may have popped into our office hours, if you have come to us funding anything construction related in terms of bricks and mortar of buildings, it's very, very difficult to do. Some of the exceptions are those that are public safety or emergency response driven. And so this is one of the programs that does allow you to actually construct a building, not a fire station. It needs to be directed towards emergency operations. I will say that we have worked with districts and other communities to do a joint venture in that capacity where they're including the Emergency Operations Center onto a fire station. And so they are able to kind of benefit from both perspectives in that capacity. You do have to have direct communication and alliance with your state, however, even through the congressionally directed spending process, in order to work with your member of Congress to apply to that process and submit a project request, you do have to have a letter of support from your local state agency, emergency response agency, saying that it does qualify and that they are willing to work with you, because you still have to have that partnership with them at the state level. There is a match. It's a 25% non-federal catch match. And again, just like the flood mitigation assistance program, you do not need to be in a designated federal or federally designated, disaster declaration to be able to apply for this. So this is open for anybody. You don't have to have that as a parameter or requirement like for some of the other FEMA dollars and programs. So that's a little bit of a nuanced one. It's one that we get a lot of questions about because it'll look like it's open for competition, but it isn't really open for competition unless you work directly with your congressional delegation. If you're looking to do that, we advise you to start talking to them now. They're in the middle of the FY26 appropriation process right now, where they are considering earmarks and projects to submit through the appropriations process. If you haven't already done that, then you'll have to wait till the next cycle, which would be for FY27 appropriations. And that cycle usually starts at the beginning of every calendar year. But any sort of work that you can do right now with your congressional delegation to let them know your interest and to start to work out some of those kinks to make sure your project does qualify and would be eligible, now's a really good time to start to get ready in that capacity. So a little intersection between grants and earmarks there. Any questions on that one? All right. All right, we're going to get a little bit into the best practices. If you participated in these best practices are universal across each of the brown bags, because they're really just advice to special districts on how you can prepare to line your projects for programs of any type or any sort. So there's basically two different categories or groups of applicants that we work with or see on the special district side. The one-time applicant, where you might not be looking to develop a robust grants program, where you just have one project or two projects in mind or priorities, and you really they fit perfectly for one individual program, and then you're just going to apply for that program. These are generally a lot more reactive. So you see the notice of funding availability open up. You say, I have a project that fits there and I want to apply. That's all great. That's in that capacity, we really advise you to take a look at the grant alerts that you're getting from NSDA that will notify you when programs are open. And start to get those grant applications ready as soon as possible. I will warn you, we are seeing with the thawing out of the federal freeze, if we want to go with that analogy, we are seeing much tighter solicitation periods. For example, there was a grant that was just recently announced that had on average about an 80 to 90 day solicitation period. So good 2 to 3 months for from the time the notice of funding availability opened up for grant applications to be submitted. That was cut down to 31 days in this year's solicitation. So we are seeing a little bit more of a tightening of the solicitation periods. A lot of that just has to do with the fact that the solicitations are delayed to begin with because of the freeze and because of the hold. And so now the agencies are trying to catch up in a way. But we did see shorter solicitations too under the first Trump administration. So we're not sure if that's going to be a pattern, but it's something that special districts should be aware of. So that when you see those notices of funding availability, pick a project, pick it fast, and start to get working on that application as soon as possible. The second type of applicant that we often see is one where you're taking a more strategic mindset. And that's really what these brown bags are about, is to help you start to think about programs well in advance of the notice of funding availability coming down, especially, as I'm saying, if we're starting to see a shortening of the solicitation periods. Often this is where you might have one or two priorities that overlap, or you're starting to win success or win grants and awards, and you're starting to combine those on top of each other, and you start to run a little mini grants program within your district. That can be very, very advantageous as you align those projects to the programs, but a lot of this work is happening in advance of the notices of funding availability. So NSDA brown bags are really helping to guide you in that. So hopefully take this information. We've got grant guides in that capacity to notify you about programs that are open on a regular basis, and then you can start to work on your projects to get those aligned. And then also line up multiple projects to see how many, if you can bring as much federal resources to your community and to your district as possible. Next slide. One of the things that we're really advising folks to do, especially now, is making sure that the terminology that you're using in describing your project really meets the funding agency's priorities. With the shift in administration, we saw this 4 years ago when the Biden administration came into office. Priorities change and language changes accordingly. And so a lot of times you can describe the exact same thing, just in different terminology and different keywords. And so you really want to try to focus that in the description of your policy or your projects, so that you are triggering what they want to see and describing what the funding agencies want to see. In the same capacity, you want to avoid any terminology that might be conflicting with executive orders. So a lot of times you might just be describing certain components of your project and maybe not the overall project. And that's fine. What you're trying to do is give them a reason to fund your project and to prioritize your project over others. You can pick up on those keywords. We've got a list that we can advise you on or review any of your grants applications to kind of give you some words to focus on and give you some words to steer away from. But you can pick up on a lot of those just through reading the executive orders and really looking at the way even the notices of funding availability are written. So pick up on those keywords that are included in the NOFO and incorporate those into your project description in the application. The other thing to consider is really the budget consideration. We hear a lot from special districts about the match requirements. It's very important to understand that almost across the board, every federal grant has some type of match requirement. Some are better than others, meaning that they actually bring additional or more federal resources to the table than others. And other programs allow you to do in-kind services or to really take advantage of some of those indirect costs that you're already spending as a district and apply those to the grant application itself in the budget process. So when you're preparing a grant application or even looking at your project and trying to match it with the program, really pay attention to those match considerations to make sure A, you have it on hand, and B, you can meet those obligations, because you will have to write those into the grant application to be competitive, and you'll certainly have to abide by those if you receive the award and the funding actually comes to your district. There are some changes in the post-award side, meaning that with some of the compliance documents, just like in any such an administration, they'll want to see different granting requirements and different compliance requirements that meet the priorities of that administration and the funding agency. So that's where you really want to try to avoid some of those pitfalls by understanding those limitations directly with the program that you're targeting, and making sure that you're prepared for those, whether or not it's on the compliance documents themselves, land acquisition or contingencies included in your budgets, or just really making sure that your budget is very much dialed in, because we anticipate that as grants are awarded and projects receive funding, that compliance metrics are going to be a key priority for the administration and the funding agencies as they administer the funds. Now, I know that that's a lot to handle, which is why we're here, not only for these brown bags, but we're here to give you advice, and really help align your projects and help you find programs that meet your priorities. There's two essential ways to do this. They're actually built on top of each other, so it makes it very simple. You can go to the NSDA website, log in, and then it'll take you to the grants portal. The NSDA project grants portal is where you can enter in information or questions. Either generally, you might just say, I'm looking to fund fire station and equipment, for example. You can add a general question in like that, or you can actually say, I have a fire station that I'm looking for funding for, or I want to put this emergency operation to my service providers, and then you can provide specific information. The biggest thing you want to do in that capacity is that gives us a little bit of knowledge about what your questions are, and then we book a consultation. So we actually have reserved time with myself as well as Amanda Wiley, where we sit down and answer your questions and talk through your projects and help point you in the right direction in terms of some programs that match those. We're also able to, I know we talked about words and looking at different words and terminology. If you have questions in that capacity, we're able to bounce those off of us as well. But really utilize those office hours as much as possible if you are considering looking at grant funding for your district in the future. Now that brings us to, this is, as I said, we've had a general overview of the federal funding landscape. Our first brown bag was on water resources and water supply. This is our second one on emergency response and disaster preparedness. And the third one of the year will be held in September on fire suppression and response. So focused on a different side of emergency response and really targeting at the fire suppression side of things as opposed to the emergency response or disaster preparedness. So for those of you that might be in both of those worlds on the webinar today, we invite you to come back. The focus to be a little bit more driven towards the wildfire and fire related emergencies. And then we'll announce for 2026 webinars. No, you're good, Gabby. So with that, I haven't seen any other questions come in to the chat or the questions. Oh, we did get one early that I answered, asking if the slides would be available. They will be, right, Chantel? They'll be posted on the website. Yes. So we'll, Chantel will get those up on the NSDA website, and then you can log into the resource library there and access them, right?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
Hey, so I was just thinking about the January 2027 process for congressionally directed spending. And I'm curious what kind of advice do you give special districts on being shovel ready? And I know how hard that is because you don't launch planning and design and NEPA work and whatever you have to do to be able to say, I'm completely ready for construction dollars.
Sure.
When you may not have a guarantee of those dollars. So I'm curious, what do they need to have in place by January to be able to
Sure.
think intelligently about their projects?
Yeah, and I think I think your question is geared towards getting a project ready for the earmarking process, but I'll talk about it overall. Sometimes we do work with districts or cities or counties where it feels like what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? You need the dollars for planning to access the construction dollars, but you can't get the construction dollars until you have the planning, but you have a difficult time figuring out where to find the funding for both. That's where that strategic approach comes into play, where you're not just looking at the notice of funding availability and what it can fund and looking at one specific program, but you're saying, I need planning dollars. And if I get planning dollars, then I can find the construction or vice versa, because there are options for both. So there are grant programs out there pretty much across the board, especially in this space, where you can access grant funding just for planning to get it ready for construction, to make it more competitive for construction dollars, or flip it the other way around. In some capacities, that investment, in some cases, the investment on the planning side could actually put you in a better position to get those bigger construction dollars. So that's a lot of what you can look at in that capacity. So in order to get shovel ready, I think it's important to understand you don't have to be shovel ready. There are ways to fund projects either through the grants process or congressionally directed spending for non-shovel ready projects. So while it's important to get those ready and kind of have a plan on how you're going to put the project into fruition, it isn't necessarily a deal breaker if you can't get it there. And even for the earmarking process, each member of Congress sets their own priorities and how they want to vet those projects and make those selections. Some members prioritize shovel ready because they want to say, all right, you have brought the project this far, you've done your own work, you've done your homework, you've put your skin in the game, I'll help you finish the project. And others will say, look, we know you can get construction dollars for this, or we can help advance this, or that investment of the federal dollars on the planning side will help leverage different additional dollars. Some members choose that. So it's really on the congressionally directed spending side of things at the members' discretion in terms of what they plan to put forward and what they want to prioritize. We work with a lot of folks that actually marry the two, where they're looking at a grant to get it ready for earmarking or vice versa. On the construction side, on average, there's more dollars in grants than there is through congressionally directed spending. So figuring out a way to piece those together to get the most investment and the most dollars and resources coming down is really where we advise districts to be strategic about those needs. Gabby, anything to add there?
Yeah, I'll just add on the competitive grant side, in terms of being shovel ready, that's something that always, you know, funding agencies like FEMA and others want to see. However, that does not eliminate you, should not discourage you. For instance, in the BRIC, one of the BRIC slides I had mentioned phased approaches, right? Stopping at a strategic project location of phase. It's because they provide money for design build. And so, right, if it's your engineering is your first phase, your design, and then your construction is your next phase, right? That's what they look at. And so that is something that absolutely FEMA has funded in the past. And as Christy mentioned, it's just really being strategic on how you approach it, how you present your project, what you request funding for. And so that's something we're certainly available to help with.
I will say that in the hazard mitigation or the emergency response side, making sure that your district is covered by a hazard mitigation program would be the biggest first step. If you are, great. If you're not sure, go find out. And if you're not covered by a hazard mitigation plan, then either look at the resources to develop one on your own or go partner with somebody. That's where you can look at the work that your neighbors are doing in the cities and counties. Or even on a regional side, we see a lot of hazard mitigation plans developed on a regional side that incorporate special districts into them, especially the smaller districts, to make sure that they're covered. So that's one of the biggest steps on the emergency response side or hazard mitigation side that you can take now, is to make sure that you are covered. That is either a requirement for some of these programs, as Gabby mentioned, and even if it isn't a requirement for that specific program, talking about that element and saying that your project is part of a larger regional hazard mitigation strategy is always going to be a benefit, whether you're looking at funding it through USDA or the Corps of Engineers or anything like that. Being able to speak to that just shows that you've done a little bit of homework already, and that you're advancing along on that planning stage. So that would be the biggest thing in this space, is to make sure that you're covered by a hazard mitigation plan. A lot of times, a lot of districts don't know that they are, quite honestly. The counties will incorporate them, or regional planning organizations will automatically incorporate them.
Exactly. Thank you.
Sure.
Any last questions? I'm not seeing anything in the chat. As always, thank you for joining us today. And as always, please go through the idea portal and reach out to the Ferguson Group. They are such a great resource. They can help walk you through these kind of questions you might have that maybe you don't want to ask on a webinar, but take it offline and give them a call. That's why we have them in our corner. So thank you, Christy and Gabby. And again, I will be posting this recording and the slides up on the website, and I'll send that out to everybody. So
Great.
thank
Thank you,
you,
everybody.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.